when one is pregnant, they're kind of quote eating for two. You have to eat and feed the baby, so they're going to be getting nutrients. But I guess what you're saying is that if there's some sort of pathology, the baby's getting too much of something, then that
Mhm.
can obviously cause issues. And that kind of goes to, insulin resistance is sort of a common thing that occurs during gestation. And so, why does that occur in typically, in the mother, they kind of develop insulin resistance during pregnancy? Is this a natural thing, or is this a pathological thing, and sort of why might this occur?
Yeah, yeah. So to back it up a little bit more, insulin resistance, of course, is the resistance of your cells to the effects of insulin, which is a storage hormone. So basically, if you're resistant to insulin, you can't get the nutrients into your cells that you need. And we have to remember that in pregnancy, our main goal is to grow a human fetus. And so we're doing any and everything we can to shunt nutrients to that developing fetus so we can optimize growth. And this insulin resistance starts really early on and it's very subtle, but it grows throughout pregnancy. So the woman becomes more and more insulin resistant as she becomes more and more pregnant. And the whole purpose is that her cells, specifically her muscle, is becoming insulin resistant so that she is saving those nutrients, glucose mostly, so that that glucose can be sent to the fetus because the glucose is the primary nutrient that the fetus develops with. Um, and the important thing to note is that as long as she is otherwise healthy, this insulin resistance is within normal range. So she becomes more insulin resistant, but it's not to a clinical level of concern, I should say. Excuse me. um, but there is something called gestational diabetes mellitus, which is where you have a random and a rapid onset of extreme insulin resistance, basically. And it normally happens in the middle to late end of pregnancy. And in that case, you're very insulin resistant. When we're talking about placental transfer of nutrients, if mom is becoming extremely insulin resistant, she can't take up any of that glucose. You are sending even more glucose to the fetus than you would if you were healthy. And so these women that have gestational diabetes typically have very, very large babies. They're called macrosomic babies. You've probably seen pictures of them. They're excessively large. And it's just like if you were to eat a ton of sugar for like 3 months, you would obviously gain weight. And so that's the same thing that happens to the fetus with women that are excessively insulin resistant. But like in general, it happens at a healthy level in a normal pregnancy unless she's unhealthy.
Got it. And so in that case, if she's becoming more insulin resistant, this would kind of imply that then she's maybe utilizing other sources of energy, fuel for energy, I guess. So how does kind of the mother's metabolic environment change then in during pregnancy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when we look at all that stuff, of course, substrate utilization is typically a balance between carbohydrate and fat. And so if she is insulin resistant in the latter stages of pregnancy, she's unable to use glucose to fuel her energy or as much glucose to fuel her energy. And so she has going to have to flip and toggle to using fat as a fuel source. And pregnancy and the stages of pregnancy are perfectly set up for her to be able to do that. In the first stage of pregnancy, like the first trimester, she typically puts on a whole lot of fat mass. And that's because as she becomes more insulin resistant, she is then able to mobilize that fat to a greater extent in the later stages of pregnancy to then be oxidized for use. So it's so interesting. A lot of women, if they're healthy, actually lose fat over the course of pregnancy because they're mobilizing it so much to be oxidized. And they also become pretty ketogenic um, because they have to use ketones to fuel.
Wow, that's so fascinating. That's not something I ever thought about, but evolution is definitely pretty crazy.
Ridiculous. Yeah, it's crazy.